Hello, everyone. My name is Gary. Welcome to, well, it's actually the final episode of XYZ Podcast in collaboration with Saigon Hoi Arts Festival. Um, it's been a pleasure working with Saigon Hoi Arts Festival, and perhaps this is the eighth episode, which is the last one as well. And then I got Su Chang joining me this episode. Um, in case just a little bit of shout out in case you miss out the previous episodes, feel free to go back to the few months that I have been producing 8 episodes or 8 interviews with the artists who were involved in this festival. So today I got Su Chang. He will talk about Weaving Waves Pavilion. That's the design by himself, Sherman and Andie. Just a little bit of background about Su Chang. He's a principal of Su Chang Design Research Office, also adjunct assistant professor in Uni of Hong Kong. So today he will talk about the pavilion they did. Maybe something that I'm not sure if the pavilion will be there after this coming Sunday, because this coming Sunday is the last day of the art festival. So perhaps this is the question that I would love to leave it to Su Chang. And hi, Su Chang. Good to see you
Hi,
here.
how's it going? Thank you
Thanks
for
for.
having me. I think, we hope that the pavilion can stay in the village if, after the festival. Yeah, and be a part of the village. Yeah.
That's very nice. Thank you so much for joining. Because I read a little bit of the brief writing. It's mentioned about the Gabion foundation, especially when the rocks is definitely going to be something that remains even after the festival. Um, and even before the interview, Su Chang actually shared a little bit on the background of Gao Sai Zhao, which is the site in this case. But before that, could you please talk a little bit about yourself? And also, I noticed something very interesting about liquid homes.
Mhm.
Perhaps you can share with us. Maybe there's some relationship with this pavilion.
Yeah, yeah. Hi, I'm Su Chang. I'm an architect, based in Hong Kong, and we have been working on research and design projects, about Hong Kong fishing villages and how the fishermen, their material culture, and the way they build basically in relationship to landscape not only as the very solid landscape but also the water environment. Um, so this is the opportunity when we were invited to join this open call and get selected to produce this artwork in Cyclone. We were also thinking about how we can learn from these techniques, these everyday techniques from the fishermen, and use them for the productions of this piece.
That's very cool. I mean, that part of the uni research, or is it kind of self-initiated?
At first, we first started with the students, and then during the summer, we formed a small team and go into these villages and start to have a more in-depth like documentations and analysis about these houses. So when we look at these opportunities, we'll first notice the site, which is actually a very interesting site because it's actually at the end of the village on a very rocky beach. And there's a very giant rock in the middle of the water that the villagers, they're very proud of. They call it a scallop rock, basically because of the form of it, look like the meat of a scallop. So basically, we think about how we can position this pavilion in relationship to the landscape, but also a place for people to get to know about the history and the site better. Yeah.
That's and also because looking into the research, could you briefly talk through the site perimeter and also the survey site? Was that part of the because I see Kaosai Zhao is maybe is part of the master plan, or was that more focusing on the area?
Yeah, at the beginning we didn't really look at this village when we're doing the research. So actually, I've only been to the village once before starting this project. But when I go there, I kind of noticed that it's kind of challenging to build on islands because it's not like building, on the land where you have, easier transportation and access. And so a lot of when we were thinking about it, we think about how it's kind of like an experiment for design and construction. So how we can packed all the components into a relatively compact package, and then ship everything in one go, and then be able to expand it into a structure on site. So if you look at the kind of the hung pavilion, the fishing nets, we actually learned it from the fishing cages that the fishermen will use to catch the fish. And so the whole structure is collapsible. So basically there are these kind of woven fishing nets and this like metal ring. And then you can collapse it into just like stack them and then transport them onto the site and then expand them into the whole structure. And another challenge is to really give a weight to this structure because it's actually a very windy location. So you can imagine if it's typhoon season, the whole pavilion can get blown away if you don't have a really strong foundation. But also we don't want to make this really say forceful anchoring into the ground. We try to avoid any permanent foundation because we want to preserve the natural ground. So we don't have any cement or concrete footings or foundations for this structure, and we don't have any any good ways to nail it onto the ground because it's really rocky beach. So basically, we make this gabion cage, and we collect all these rocks on site, put them into the metal framed cage, so it become a self to basically increase the self weight of the pavilion. So then it's actually can be just standing onto these rocky beaches. Yeah.
I mean, before the interview, you shared something very interesting about the place itself. Could you please, because you mentioned about some British writer who
Yeah.
been maybe living in Gao Sai Chao and then
Yeah. So
wrote.
Gaosaitao actually before the festival, actually we don't have public ferry, so not everyone, even in Hong Kong, not everyone knows about Gaosaitao. But actually, it's quite important for the urban history of Hong Kong because um, during the 1950s, there's this British anthropologist, Barbara E. Ward. She traveled all the way from the UK to Hong Kong to study South China. And basically, she wanted to learn how people in South China live, behave from an anthropological standpoint. So she chose this village and stayed here for 7 years just to live with the villagers, live with the fishermen and observe how they would live, how they would, go fishing, how they would produce, how they interact with people from other, part of the regions.
Mm. I mean, then looking into well, I mean, perhaps now we can jump into the pavilion as well because now looking in the pavilion Weaving Waves Pavilion is sort of very specifically targeting on the history of fishermen and also the fishing culture as well as both culturally or as a economic reaction to the pavilion itself. But I'm quite curious looking into the importance of fishing because I interviewed previous participants or artists who mentioned about fishing and take inspiration from the activity, the business activity, or may happen in the leisure way as well. But I'm quite curious from your point of view, looking into the fishing industry, is there any particularly different from the other locations looking from Gao Sai Zhao? Perhaps it's much more bigger than the other places or
Yeah. I
other
think
islands. Yep.
actually the location is quite interesting. If you look at Gaosaitao from Google Map, it's actually at a very strategic locations between the inner sea and the outer sea of Saigon. So basically, it has this kind of bottleneck, a small water channel between these two like larger body of water. So it becomes a kind of like a gateway between the inner sea and the outer sea. And so if you look at the way the fishermen will build their houses, it's actually quite smart. Although at that time they don't have this kind of discourse or methods about smart cities, smart buildings. They already know how the buildings should be sited at a strategic locations to avoid the kind of impact from typhoon or from the wind, and how they can reserve decent amount of flat land to repair boats or to dry fishes. So actually a lot of lessons can be learned just by observing how they're built in relationship to the natural environment. Yeah.
Uh,
And so when we look at the village, we also think about how it's also an identity of the city. Because Hong Kong, I imagine a lot of the audience were probably not necessarily from Hong Kong. So for a lot of my friends that are not from Hong Kong, when we talk about Hong Kong, everyone's first impression is, the Victoria Harbour, Central, skyscraper, international city. That's true. It's a very high density city. But also Hong Kong is wonderful because it's only reserving 70% of land for development. There's also 30% of the land that's natural reserve. And then there's a large population in the city that's living in what we normally not would be regarded as urban area. They live in the villages or the suburb. So that's also a very large part of Hong Kong that people don't necessarily know about. So we want to also I think that's also part of the goal of the festival is to get the people familiar with another side of Hong Kong that's also really intrinsic to the nature of the city. Yeah.
I think looking into the geographical landscape of Hong Kong itself is very unique, where perhaps you couldn't find it anywhere else. I think a lot of people just remember about the Hong Kong Island and also the Kowloon area, but there are lots of mountains and islands that I think sort of shun away from the general tourist perspective as well, or not just for tourists but travelers to
Yeah.
Hong Kong to realize that. Now let's moving on to the pavilion, which I find is very interesting that you look into such a basic element from the fishing industry, yet come up with something rich in a sense that is kind of serve as a reminder of a past history. Perhaps it's still going on now, the fishing industry. Could you talk a little bit about the design configuration itself, or isn't the outlook as a form? It looks, I mean, from far, I thought it's a basketball. It's a basketball ring. It's kind of like a aluminium hoop, but it stands above kind of like a benches and some steps.
Yeah, so actually it has several components. So you have the main frame is made of metal, but it's a kit apart, so we can take it apart, transport it onto the site and assemble together. So there was this also main structure that we just talked about, which is made of this fishing net and the metal rings. And we hung it with these cables. So from afar, with the wind is kind of slightly moving, it gives you a little bit, it throw you all off a little bit. It's kind of like losing a sense of gravity, like the fishing cages in the water, because it's a very windy site. Also, another very important component of the pavilion is the kind of the mat that we created through a workshop with the public participants. That is kind of, we use these weaving techniques. So we think about how people can participate, not just literally come in and build or just do drawings, but how the technique of making itself require participation. And we think about weaving. And weaving itself is something that cannot be done by one person because of these, we have these triangular configurations. So you need to thread through the frame from all three directions, require three people to participate in the making of one component. So naturally, the making itself, it's a collective effort. And then after the workshop, we also invite each of the participants to sign their names at the corner of the frame. So if you go to the pavilion, you look at these like the seating mats, you will see the names of everyone that's participated and be a part of the making process. So eventually, each of these participants in our workshop also have a part of the ownership and authorship the making of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting there because well, I mean, sort of the remnants of the fishing industry and also the village itself is especially in the rural settings, most of the elements and also collective memory, it happens in a group rather than an independent entity in a way, even though they sort of form with individuals, entities, and also elements that compile together as one big fabric, complicated fabric of the memory and also history as well. Speaking of that kind of a collective effort, that's what the good thing about, as a teamwork and also you yourself as an artist who wants to curate the effort and also program for the villagers or the participants to enjoy. However, what about is there any challenges while creating such a artwork? I suppose, I mean, it's great that we wanted to celebrate about the teamwork, but is there what are the challenges in putting out everyone together, especially the architects or non-artists or artists to get working together in one piece?
Yeah, of course, it's a lot of challenges. We're actually very happy the curator, the one by team actually helped us a lot in this kind of process. Um, I think one of the biggest challenges is to really like think about how this can be deployed and built on site in a rather, say, reasonably efficient way. Because on an island, it's not like in a city, you have relatively less resources. Um, you don't have the truck to bring all the tools, right? If you miss anything, you probably need to come back and go the next day or 2 days later to wait for the next boat. So actually a lot of design is not just about designing the form or the object itself, but also designing the process of construction, the process of transportation,
A
the
lot
process
of
of
coordinations going on.
yeah. So the process itself is actually taking us much longer time and effort to think and design. Actually, I think we require design, how many tools we bring, how can we pack them in the most efficient way so
Mm.
we can fit it into a reasonably sized, boat, from Cyclone Pier to the island. So all these constraints that are something we don't really usually have if we say make a building in a city, but actually also give you new sources of creativity because you need to take into considerations and you need to really be creative when you are facing these kind of challenges. Yeah.
Mm. And especially that it happens in a rather secluded area as well. I mean, it takes travel to. I mean, it's not just in the outside. So I imagine all the participants in these art festivals sort of like that impose a
Yeah.
very interesting elements into the design
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
And I think another challenge would be, anticipating how the visitors, the public will respond to your work. Because we kind of try to want to avoid the very literal symbolic representation about the village or the fishermen or the fishing culture. Because I feel like that's the easy way out. You make a form of a fish, you make a form of, I don't know, like a object, and the people take it very literally and just take the most, superficial symbolic meaning out of it, and then they just go home. We kind of want people to come in, not just to see the form, but understand the culture.
Mm.
Um, so I think also so that requires a little bit of thinking and designing, like how to anticipate how people would react to the work. And then because you need to have a sense of familiarity so people can understand it, but also you need to build in a little bit of surprise. So people can also, have like a kind of like a response to it. They need to have a, process it, through their own thinking. So I think that's a little bit uh, like that's quite hard. And then we try to think, okay, we just borrow the technique from the fishermen, but we don't literally make, their tent or their, I don't know, the vessels, whatever. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's very cool to put in aside. I think a lot of listeners might learn something new as well. I mean, apart from the design, there are so many other coordination and also I would say much more on the project management going on apart from the design. So yeah. Well, I think I do have one last thing. I know that Su Chang, you need to go, so sorry about that. But I do have one last thing because since well, you are actually the last um artists to join in this podcast series, I thought to invite you to share the final notes in general, your point of view, perhaps is your expectation or certain hope for all the sites, not just about Khao Sai Zao, but in general as Sao Hoi Art Festival. I perhaps you can share something for the listeners. I mean, you yourself as perhaps as an educator, as an architect, and also the participant as well.
Yeah. Of course, I'm thinking how, like, because there's a lot of visitors this year, and then I feel like in general, the how we live and how we think about, say, tourism, or how we think about the way we live is also changing, right? Before people think about coming to Hong Kong, they go shopping, they go sightseeing, they go to the Peak, they go to Central. That's the usual way, right? How people travel. But naturally, people after COVID, I think we have a little bit more awareness of the environment. And when we go to a new place, we also want to explore not just the generic or the cliche, right? We want to know what are the indigenous culture there. And it could be about cultural heritage for some of these villages. It could also be about the natural environment and ecology and the geography. And then all these are really trending, I think. And not only in Hong Kong, but I think around the world. People now go to new places. They don't want to just go to those, places that they've been seeing for the past 10 years on all Google searches, right? They want to discover something new. And then they want to get to know about the real culture and the real places. I think that's something that our festival was trying to do, which is to bring visitors to these places that you might have heard of before, but don't really have the opportunity to go. And now you have, I would see these art pieces more like the kind of catalyst that to provoke some kind of larger changes, because we are not gonna have the resources to make, new settlement, new cities, new development, but then they can become this kind of point to trigger a larger, transformation about the way we live and the way we see our cities. Yeah.
That's very nice. I really like the way that you put by describing the installations, or well, it's not just the artworks itself, but also there are so many workshops and group activities happen as well during the festival. It serves as a catalyst in triggering a certain point for attraction. Yeah.
We also had this, conversation with the curators, and we also talk about, because we talk about weaving, and one of the argument we try to do is that the whole festival itself is a kind of weaving process. You have these different points, right? You have this artwork, their locations, but also have these activities. You just mentioned these workshops and these like guided tours. And they are basically different narrative, different stories about the area. And then the festival itself is a kind of weaving process to weave all these different points and locations together to form a kind of net and have these kind of networks of ideas floating around. So people come in, they would have to, experience not just, single isolated point, but also the story in between.
Thank you very much, Su Chang. Very nice to have you to recap the the whole episode as well, the podcast series. I wish you all the best, and thank you so much for joining us. And thanks for your time.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. See ya.